Hello and welcome to the first webinar in our 2015 High Tunnel webinar series. I'm Miranda Combs and I'm an Extension Associate with the Center for Crop Diversification at the University of Kentucky. Today we'll learn about season extension opportunities and EQIP funding. Dr. Shubin Saha, a UK Extension Professor in the Department of Horticulture, will cover the different options available for season extension, and Dr. Tim Woods, a UK Extension Professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics, will cover some marketing and budgeting information. Later in the presentation, I'll be covering the NRCS EQIP program funding information. We hope you enjoy the presentation and take away some great information. Without any further ado, I will hand the presentation over to Dr. Shubin Saha. Welcome, Shubin.
Thanks, Miranda. So, as Miranda's already mentioned, and you've probably seen in some of the flyer material that's been sent out via email and other avenues, this is a High Tunnel webinar series, but one thing I thought that would help us get started is to take maybe just one little step back and talk about protected agriculture in general, and give you some idea. Before we talk about protected ag, I want to mention one gentleman who used to be here at University of Kentucky. Emory Emmert was a professor of horticulture from 1928 to 1962. He is known as the father of plasticulture, plasticulture being the use of plastic materials in agriculture. He was the first to use plastic for covering tunnels or greenhouses. And actually, if you look in the image here on the left, behind him, there's actually a structure that is covered with plastic, clear plastic as opposed to glass, which would have been what was traditional in the time. But the work that Emory Emmert has done has led to a massive expansion of plasticulture throughout the world, and he's had tremendous impact that many people actually aren't very aware of. And so I just wanted to bring that about since we are talking about plasticulture. So what is protected agriculture? Protected agriculture is the general use of structures and or materials to protect crops outside of typical production season. So in the state of Kentucky, the summer is our typical production season, but outside of that would be fall, winter, and spring. Some types of examples of protected agriculture would include greenhouse, high tunnels, low tunnels, cold frames, and row covers. And we'll get a little bit more into specific definitions here in a moment about the different types of protected agriculture. But before we do that, let's talk about some of the benefits of protected agriculture. So it gives you some variable management of your environmental conditions. So for instance, why we say variable, in a low tunnel or say a row cover, you can improve your environment to a small extent, but it doesn't give you the same environmental control that an actively heated and cooled greenhouse can. So you have varying levels of environmental management with these structures, certainly greenhouse probably being the highest. It gives you protection from the elements, so you're thinking about cold and wind, but also thinking about rainfall. Because generally speaking, leaf wetness is attributed to foliar diseases in most vegetable crops. If you can reduce the leaf wetness through a number of different means, such as growing it in a high tunnel, you can help reduce foliar disease issues. Because you're growing in a high productivity type of system, and usually the season can be extended, you have increased yield, but because you're keeping it away from the elements, you have improved fruit quality. And then probably more important, more recently, is that it helps support local food production. There's potential for year-round production, and now we're seeing a demand for year-round produce or year-round local produce. And then lastly, it's just allowing you to extend that season. So you say, why season extension? Basically, season extension is going to allow an earlier planting or even maybe a later planting for an earlier harvest. Bottom line is what you're trying to do is get into a market window where the value is going to be higher, which is something you have to do in a structure such as this because it's costing you more per square foot to produce within the structure. It allows you to lengthen the season, so not only can you get earlier harvest, but you can extend the harvest season. And so oftentimes you'll see where although the price may dip down through the typical summer season, it may start to come back up as you get into the fall when some of the other products aren't quite as readily available. Again, we've had great interest in local food movement in the state of Kentucky, but certainly throughout the Midwest and other parts of the U.S. I've already mentioned it allows you to get into the earlier market window, but it also allows more access to fresh fruits and vegetables for consumers. And also one of the things that we've targeted, which my colleague will probably touch more on, is moving farm food into school systems. So I'm going to show you now a bunch of different examples of different types of production facilities. So what you are looking at now is formerly known as Eurofresh in Wilcox, Arizona. This is a 600-acre glasshouse facility I had the chance to visit in 2007. It's broken up into 50-acre blocks. This is probably one of the more highly technologically advanced greenhouse systems in the country, if not the world, just in the way it's been managed and the way it's been operated. They grow tomatoes in these structures 365 days a year. There really is no downtime. But this is what I would classify as a true greenhouse. It's actively heated and actively cooled. And although this is in Arizona, there is a certain time of year where you do need heating in Arizona because at this particular location, they're at an elevation of 4,000 feet. This is another example. So what you just saw was probably one end of the extreme, very large commercial production facility. And now we're looking at a much smaller production facility in central Indiana. One of the reasons why I show you this image here is because these are freestanding structures as opposed to gutter-connected structures like we saw in the last image. And freestanding structures are going to be probably more along the lines of what's typical, certainly for growers in the state of Kentucky. But I would assume this is probably more common for smaller growers in general. But the one thing I want to point out here is so you can see some different types of architecture. The two houses on the right are not the same as the one on the left. These are actually true greenhouses because they're actively heated and cooled. But the one thing you'll notice is the house on the far left, you can see that it has a straight sidewall. And so it actually has a sidewall vent that will open up. Where the two houses on the right, there are no sidewall vents, and you see that it curves and comes all the way to the ground. And if anything that I want you to take home from this image here is look at how close the structures are to one another. As a general rule of thumb, there should be the same amount of distance between two structures as there is from top to bottom. So if the height of that particular greenhouse in the middle is 20 feet there, then there needs to be 20 feet between each of those houses. Because in this particular situation, this grower is not optimizing productivity because the houses are too close together and they're going to shade one another. So this is just the inside of a greenhouse system, similar to what you would have seen in Eurofresh. These are true soilless culture system where they're growing in rock wool and collecting all the leachate. This is an indeterminate tomato system where the same plant will be grown for 12 months. You'll harvest it for about a 9 to 10 month season. And just some of the other things we point out here is, how are they heating? Again, this is an actively heated structure, so this is a true greenhouse. And so what you've got here is these railway pipes, and these pipes actually running down the row middles serve multiple purposes. So the first purpose and why they're there is the fact that they provide, the hot water passes through there and the radiant heat comes from the hot pipe in terms of heating the greenhouse. But it also provides a rail system. So they have carts that will fit on that like a train that they can push down those rails. They can use scissor jacks to get up to the height because these plants are going to grow anywhere from 12 to 15 feet tall. And you can't get that high just on your feet, so you need to be able to do it some way. So in this system, it allows easier access to that. This is just a different crop here within. Again, this is soilless culture system. These are summer squash. These are trellised vertically. By the time this crop is done growing, it'll probably reach about 6 to 7 feet in height. It's not grown exactly the same way as you typically think of in the open field. But it's a fairly long crop, or a much longer crop, I should say, in the greenhouse as it is to the open field. And the other thing, which may be a potential opportunity, depending on the region you're in, is seeing individuals that can actually market the male flowers from these squash plants and sell those as an edible component. Only issue with those is that they have a very short shelf life, so you have to have your buyer in a very close proximity because they're not going to last long. And then show you another crop here. This is a little bit different production system. We've got lay flat bags. We've got lay flat bags filled with perlite here. There's usually 2 plants per bag. These are seedless cucumbers, also known as English cucumbers, generally individually shrink wrapped. But this is a true soilless culture system and a true greenhouse where you're actively heating and actively cooling depending on the time of year. And here we also have bell peppers. These are grown in a little bit different type of trellis system. This is what we would call a Spanish trellis. You can see instead of having stakes down the row middle, we have stakes on either side, and we're generally creating a cage here. But this just shows you some of the different containers one might use to grow in a soilless system in a greenhouse, and show you there's a number of different options on crops as well. So we've talked a little bit about greenhouses, let's move on to high tunnels now, and a few things that I want to touch on with these. So the picture you're looking at right now are high tunnels in Vincennes, Indiana, and I'm building two identical structures to this currently in Lexington. So not everybody will agree on the difference between a high tunnel and a greenhouse, but to simplify it, the way I look at it is a high tunnel is a passively heated structure. There's no active heating of the structure. So a few things that I want to point out while we're looking at this image here is they look really essentially the same as any greenhouse. And the fact of the matter is the materials, the instructions, it all essentially is going to be the same when you compare a greenhouse to a high tunnel. Same manufacturers even quite often. But again, this is passively heated and cooled. So a few things that I want to point out here is, so let's talk about orientation. So these houses are running lengthwise north to south. And then you can't see it right here, but there's actually the seam here on this side of the roof. There's a ridge vent that actually opens up and hinges. So we've already touched on the spacing concept. So you see that these houses are further apart. So these were about 20 feet in height. So we made sure that we had 20 feet when we built these between them so we weren't self-shading. So that's with regards to the spacing. Now the orientation, so we run them north-south because we're going to grow self-shading crops like trellis cucumbers, tomatoes, peppers. And so by running them north-south, you're going to minimize that self-shading. If you'd run them east-west or built them east-west, you would have many rows that are being shaded by the rows that are on the southernmost part of the structure. In this way, you're going to optimize light uniformity throughout the structure. So it's important from a light perspective in this latitude, but it's also important for a structure that has a ridge vent. Because it's passively ventilated, you want to maximize the loss of heat. And so heat rises. And so you look at this opens up to one side. And so the vent will open up and actually is facing towards the east. And because our prevailing winds are coming from the right, which is the west, winds come across the top. And as it comes across the top, when that vent is open, it convectively pulls hot air out. If those structures were open, or if those vents were opening facing to the west, it would actually be counterproductive and actually would push all the hot air down into the structure, which is exactly what you don't want to happen. I know although we talk about heating quite frequently when we talk about high tunnels, cooling is something else that you need to be aware of, and we'll talk about in a later webinar, but at least want to be on your radar, that excessive heat is also a problem, not just excessive cold. So here we're looking inside one of those structures. You say, well, what's the difference? Again, as I've already mentioned, that the high tunnels and greenhouses are fairly similar, but notice there's no active heating in here. We don't have any hanging Modine-style heaters or anything of that nature. You can actually see now the ridge vent in this structure from the inside where it's opened up, and you can see that it's facing east. And we have two different general types of tomatoes growing in this structure right now. We've got a determinate tomato crop here using the similar Spanish trellis system I showed you a moment ago. And then we've got the indeterminate type system where you're growing up on a vertical string here. But notice just the spacing we've got, it's similar. One thing that you'll see maybe is another major difference between a high tunnel and a true greenhouse is quite frequently in a true greenhouse, or rather a high tunnel, you're going to be growing in the soil only. Where many of the greenhouses you'll also see soilless culture in addition to soil production. So after we finished with that tomato crop in late July, it had gotten quite hot that season, to be quite frank, and we had a lot of time left over, but the tomatoes weren't in good enough shape to carry on. So we cut our tomatoes at the soil line. This is the same tunnel, the same plastic mulch and everything. We cut all our tomatoes, removed them from the house and took them to the compost pile, swept up and cleaned, and then we punched holes in between where the tomatoes had been planted, and we had transplanted what you see now, about 2-week-old cucumber transplants in place here. This gives us a double crop, which is nice because we can basically we don't have to do any more prep work like we did for the tomato crop, and we can come back and get another crop off of it. Now, if you remember from what you just saw a moment ago, this is the same high tunnel, but you can see the crop is much further along at this point. I'd say it's probably approaching 9 to 10 feet in height. Let's talk about low tunnels briefly. They're lower cost relative to greenhouses and high tunnels. There is some potential for increased labor with the regular venting. So if you think about it, it's going to be determined on the type of material. So if you use a perforated tunnel, it's going to retain less heat, and you're probably not going to have to worry about venting. But at the same time, retaining less heat is partially a problem because you're trying to maximize the heat in a low tunnel system typically. You can use low tunnels within a high tunnel. That's something else we'll show you some examples of shortly. I've seen metal or plastic half hoops in clear poly, and generally the sides are held down with soil or sandbags, or I've even seen bags of rocks. Um, Typically speaking, in the open field, when I see low tunnels, they're usually in conjunction with a raised bed plasticulture system. And just to give you kind of a comparison, maybe with low tunnels, depending on the crop and the latitude you're in, you might be able to plant 3 to 4 weeks earlier in a low tunnel, or in a high tunnel, you're looking at maybe 6 to 10 weeks earlier for warm season crops, I should say at least. And then looking at possibly greens in the wintertime. Now, just got a few different images of low tunnels, and some of these would be considered commercial, some of them would be considered more hobby, but it's really just to show you the different types of protected agriculture that are out there, and certainly allow you at that point to run with your creativity and figure out what might work best for you. Here we've got small raised beds built out of wood framing, filled with soil or media, and then they've used electrical conduit and bent that and used brackets to mount it on the inside and then cover with poly. Similar type of thing, a little bit larger and a little bit maybe more aesthetically pleasing. This looks like a homeowner, and they're also trying to keep it aesthetically, have some aesthetic value to it as well, because you see the nice woodwork they've done in the trim. But I've seen this done on a lot less attractive way, but still work just as well. And again, it's just to show you some different possibilities. So what you had just seen previously was probably more of a very small scale or homeowner type scale use of low tunnels. This is a much larger scale use of low tunnels. This is actually in southwest Indiana. They're covering melon crops up in the early part of the season when they couldn't transplant without them. And this is all generally done by machine. I've seen the hoops laid by hand, but they actually have a machine pulled behind the tractor which will pull the poly over and cover it, similar to what you use for a plastic layer. Now what we're looking at is a low tunnel within a high tunnel. This actually doesn't have the covering over the low tunnel currently, but the reason I show you this one is that they've crisscrossed. If you take a look here, they have actually if you look here, they've crisscrossed the bows in the center of the picture, and that provides some added support for that low tunnel. And it doesn't have to be really structurally that sound, because you shouldn't be seeing the wind and other type of environmental exposure, because it's already within the tunnel, within the high tunnel, I should say. And so this gives you some greater capability of retaining heat by putting the low tunnel within this tunnel, or within the high tunnel itself. Here what we see is a clear polyethylene low tunnel, but notice that this one is perforated. Down the left side, it's perforated to allow some ventilation. But again, you're not going to have to maybe vent that type of low tunnel, but you're not going to get as much heating capacity or as much heat retention in that type of tunnel. Here we've got some other types of low tunnels. Some you see in the lower right using bags of sand or rock to hold them down. This is a remay, which is a breathable type fabric. The top right, you've got another more small scale type low tunnel system. And then on the upper left, you've got open field plasticulture with low tunnels over top. The only thing I'll point out, and we'll touch on maybe in another webinar just briefly today, is that you notice these particular plants within those low tunnels have flowers on them, and usually you need bees to pollinate your flowers. So that's another concern with low tunnels, is how long are the low tunnels in place? Because if you've got flowers that are ready, you've got no bees that can work in there, you're not going to have any viable fruit. Again, just another image of a low tunnel, different type of low tunnel setup within a high tunnel. This individual made a walkway down the middle of the structure. Very easily took some metal conduit to make the frames for the top of the low tunnel, and then just drove some PVC pipe in the ground, and then they'll just pull the fabric up over the top. Cold frames is essentially a tiny greenhouse, tiny solar greenhouse. They've been around for quite some time. This is one place where the orientation will be a little different because of the way they're designed. Usually you want these facing east-west. And the reason being is because you're trying to utilize the thermal mass to retain heat, which is, so in the lower right image, that back wall is not clear, the wall that we can't see. That back wall is usually solid, filled with 55-gallon drums, maybe filled with water or sand possibly. That's acting as a heat retention, then it will radiate heat out in that type of structure. Usually plants that are most cold sensitive, you'll plant closer to that wall, and ones that are more cold tolerant, you can plant further away from that wall. Number of different types of materials to use: wood, hay, stone, brick. A lot of maybe what you can just find around your facility, but it's usually passively heated and ventilated as well. These really are not for production, more for demonstration or just illustrating a point of a cold frame. They already had a building in place that are using the brick as the thermal mass, and as the sun comes through, it heats up that brick wall and allows heat to build up within that small structure. Several different examples here of some different cold frames. They use some hay bales here to help build the structure itself, and some old windows I've seen done. I've seen it done with just plastic. This just shows her here. She's able to harvest some leafy greens in the middle of snow season. And this is just another example of a different type wood-based frame using a clear corrugated material you typically would use to cover a greenhouse with already, and kind of giving it, using the ground also as a thermal mass. So again, we've just got more examples here of different types of cold frames. Lastly, we'll touch on row covers for different types of structures. Row covers are generally lower cost relative to low tunnels and cold frames. Row covers are generally not suitable for all crops. Can be a problem on taller crops, especially if you're using stakes already or you've already driven the stakes. Typically, row covers are going to be a fabric which is breathable as opposed to a polyethylene. You're going to get less cold protection relative to the low tunnels, and the primary reason being is that the low tunnel, the hoops keep the plastic off of the plant. So if the plant is touching that plastic and it gets very cold outside, it's really going to cause damage to the plant. So keeping that plastic off of the plants helps with minimizing damage. You could use row covers within high tunnels, within low tunnels. It does provide an extra layer of cold protection in some of these types of systems. It may also help with late frosts, but as far as giving you an earlier planting date, maybe 1 to 2 weeks, but not much more than that. So again, we're just showing you pictures of row covers used in the open field on the right and within the tunnel on your left. As far as crops for low tunnels and row covers, leafy greens are probably #1 crop for cool season. Something like vining crops like watermelon, cantaloupe, or cucumbers, even cold crops. But it's generally not going to be conducive to taller crops like stake tomatoes. Structural integrity certainly becomes a concern with those types of structures because of extreme weather. Some years also, weather's conditions aren't going to dictate a benefit from the early planting, and I've seen that happen in Southwest Indiana. Sometimes the stuff that they plant under low tunnels does not mature any faster than what they plant 2 to 3 weeks later without the low tunnels. It's going to be a gamble year to year. Raised bed and plastic mulch is often used in these systems. You want to make sure that your plastic is installed tightly in any of these types of systems, because if it doesn't, you're going to have a lot of flapping, and when it flaps, the plastic doesn't last near as long. And then pollination is something that needs to be a concern, because the covering needs to be removed by first flower, again, to allow for pollinator species to visit the flowers. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Miranda.
Great, thanks so much, Shubin. So I'm going to cover some of the EQIP funding information today. I'm very sorry that the Kentucky NRCS folks weren't able to be here and participate with us for the webinar. But we're going to go through some of the information and give you some resources to look into for the future. So I hope most of you have heard of the EQIP program. It's the Environmental Quality Incentives Program through the Natural Resource Conservation Service that provides financial and technical assistance to agricultural producers in order to address natural resource concerns and deliver environmental benefits to your land. So the Seasonal High Tunnel Initiative is just one of the EQIP programs, and that's what we're going to cover today. So the goal of the Seasonal High Tunnel Initiative program is to assist producers to extend the growing season for high-value crops in an environmentally safe manner. And just another note, if you're interested in some of the other EQIP programs, go ahead and visit your local NRCS office and talk to them about some of those opportunities. So here are the general EQIP requirements for the Seasonal High Tunnel Initiative. You must be able to say that you own or control the eligible land that you'd like to put your high tunnel structure on. You must have a farm number from the Farm Service Agency. You'll have to comply with some limitation provisions through NRCS and be in compliance with their highly erodible land and wetland conservation requirements. And also, if you don't already have an NRCS EQIP plan of operations in place, they will help you set that up at the time you apply for your high tunnel. So again, visit your NRCS Service Center to learn exactly what you need for your farm specifically to be eligible for the EQIP program. So who can apply? Generally, there's anybody can apply, individuals, general partnerships, limited partnerships, joint ventures, and corporations, and then churches, charities, and nonprofits, as long as you're engaged in agricultural production. As an agricultural producer, you can also apply. So generally, any ag producer is eligible. Schools are a question that comes up a lot that usually are not able to apply simply because they are not an ag producer. There are some other limitations and issues with that. If you do have questions about it, I would encourage you to go to your NRCS Service Center and talk to someone specifically about those issues. So these are the real quick and easy general producer eligibility criteria for any of the EQIP programs. Like I said, you need to be an agricultural producer, be able to control the land, have to be in compliance with some of the payment provisions through NRCS, must be in compliance with some of their requirements, and also need to be within the payment limitation requirements. And these are usually state-based. So again, visit your local service center to decide that. Starting this year in 2015, you'll have to be in compliance with adjusted gross income requirements, and you'll also have to obtain a Duns and Bradstreet number. And these numbers are used in the USDA to keep track of your application and that kind of stuff. They're very easy to apply for. They're both free, so go ahead and take care of that stuff. The application for EQIP also contains an 18-page appendix that covers all the fine print that goes along with the eligibility. So for further questions, I would suggest looking through the application appendix, and then for anything else, talk to your local NRCS provider. And just a note, we do have the blank EQIP application available in the left corner of your screen in the Files to Download section, so you can pull that right from the webinar. So for 2015, the Seasonal High Tunnel Initiative now provides financial assistance to construct a high tunnel on a cost per square foot basis up to $10,000 in Kentucky. Note that this is different than in past years. EQIP used to fund the cost per square foot only up to 2,178 square feet, which worked out to about a tunnel that was about 30 by 72 feet. So this change is really exciting for Kentucky growers and something that we should really be taking advantage of here in the state. Also new for Kentucky in 2015 is that participants who have already have a high tunnel funded through the EQIP program are also eligible to apply for a second high tunnel. However, first-time applicants are given a priority during the application scoring process that NRCS takes into consideration. But feel free to apply for another one if you're really using your high tunnel and really enjoying using it, and it's really been helping build up your business. So that is a new option. For folks in other states, please note that these are Kentucky changes specifically. Your state may have some different rules or different payment caps that go along with your state in particular, or they might just go along with the regular national standards. So please visit your local NRCS service center or check out your state's NRCS website online. So when to apply? You can apply for any of these EQIP programs on a continuous basis. Each state sometimes establishes deadlines for certain application periods in which they will rank and score applications after a certain period. The next Kentucky deadline for EQIP is March 20th. So for those of you growers in Kentucky that are looking forward to doing this, March 20th is the target date. But applications can be submitted after that, and they will just be considered in the next round of funding opportunity from NRCS. So again, for our Kentucky growers, here is the Kentucky Seasonal High Tunnel Initiative contact information. Kentucky EQIP does have its own specific website, and the link is on your screen. The contact for our NRCS state office is there. Dina Weeby is a really great person to work with and talk to if you have any questions. So her contact information is there. And also to locate your specific NRCS center, at a county level or even at a regional level, they have this really cool application online that you can go to locate your service center. So here's a picture of that app that's online. The link is available here, and you just go in and click on your state. Sometimes it'll let you put in a county or a region, and then it'll pop up, however many service stations are near you. So definitely take advantage of that. So applications, where to find them? Applications are available at your local NRCS office. If you have questions, you go to talk to them. They can provide an application for you right there. I've also heard from producers that you can often just fill out the application while you're there talking to them and submit it that day. Not too hard to do. Again, you can look up your NRCS Service Center through that map that we just talked about. You can also submit applications electronically, and forms are available at the e-government website through USDA. The link is also on this slide. And then again, the application is available in the file pod for download in the left corner of the screen. So go on and take advantage of that while it's there. Another thing that's available in our file download is the FAQs about the Seasonal High Tunnel Initiative that Dina Weeby provided for us. So if you do have a few more questions, they might be answered through that fact sheet that she created for this program for us. So for any other further information about the EQIP program, please visit NRCS online or go see them in person. They have lots of information available, lots of different programs that you can take advantage of. So please do that. And with that, I will pass the presentation over to Dr. Tim Woods.
Thanks, Miranda. So what we're going to close up with here are just a few comments and observations about the economics and marketing associated with high tunnel production. And certainly as we look at high tunnels as a cropping system, there's lots of opportunity for us to utilize high tunnels for early, late season farmers market activities, on-farm retailing. A lot of CSAs are using high tunnels at an increasing rate. But even for some of the direct marketing, direct to restaurant, direct to grocery, for a lot of the more traditionally off-season markets like farm to school, those suddenly become more tractable with high tunnel production systems. And there are even certain local markets that are more wholesale oriented with some of our auctions and limited wholesale opportunities that could be a potential fit for a high tunnel production system. As Shubin had talked about there earlier, as we look at one of the things that is really driving the interest to season extension are things like the interest into local products to local markets, the very strong demand across all of these different market channels for more locally sourced, regionally sourced products. And so working with some of these different retailers presents an opportunity to integrate your high tunnel and maybe even open a door for some production that could be delivered to a restaurant, for example, that would like to have a supplier for a little bit longer period of time. And a high tunnel allows those producers to be able to do that. As we look across some of the different market channels that we have in Kentucky, we do this survey periodically to look at marketing activity by market channel. And you can see there's still very strong emphasis on farmers markets, on-farm retail markets. And certainly as we look at the high tunnels, they definitely tend to lean toward these more retail oriented markets. And part of the reason why we're seeing such a strong interest and uptake in the high tunnel production systems here in Kentucky is just with the prevalence of these kinds of markets that we have here in the state. We also did a survey here recently asking producers to give some indication of where they saw market channels growing over the next several years, and really pretty much across the board, fairly bullish, optimistic perspectives on these different market channels. And certainly having season extension helps producers be able to access these market channels much better and can contribute significantly to the kinds of opportunities that they're going to see that are going to be profitable inside some of these different market channels. So one of the things that I want to just spend a little bit of time on are the economics of high tunnel production. We're going to have an opportunity at in a later webinar to actually go into some of the more particulars, the details on marketing and marketing programs that are available for folks selling into some of these market channels. But one of my favorite budget fact sheet resource materials actually comes from Iowa State for high tunnels. And I'm going to make reference to some of the material that's been provided in this publication, which you'll be able to download that full publication down here in your files to download. And so it's in your files to download, and encourage you to pull the publication up, and it's got some really nice worksheet like material in there that you can work through to figure out some of the costs that might be corresponding to your own production system. As Shubin had mentioned earlier, wide variety of choices that are available for protected agriculture systems, and some of them are very, very simple row cover, low tunnel type systems that you can see in terms of a cost per square foot, not very capital intensive at all. You're looking at 25 cents to 50 cents a square foot on up to some of the various ranges of high tunnels that are, some of them relatively low cost, some of them more semi-permanent type structures that can range from $1.30 all the way up to $2.50 a square foot. A lot of it, of course, depending on the size of the structure, the kinds of materials that you're going to be using, the kind of mechanization that might be available to provide ventilation or other kinds of access kinds of things, all the way up to what you might see with your production-ready glass greenhouse, and even there, wide range in terms of the kinds of costs and kinds of systems that are going to be used there. And so when you're talking about spending $8 to $30 a square foot, you're talking about needing to have that system provide substantial increase in productivity and in crop values. But that's ultimately the goal of a lot of our protected agriculture anyway, is to make some small capital investment to help us increase productivity, increase crop values, and be able to access the timing to markets in a way that is going to make that capital investment hopefully more than pay for itself. So I just wanted to have a look at a few of the figures associated with this Iowa State budget, just to kind of walk us through how we might think about looking at the economics associated with a system like this. The budget uses a fairly standard 30 by 72 foot 2160 square foot system that you will see very commonplace for a high tunnel. In this case, making an assumption of a $7,000 system that is that includes installation. And as you'll see when we get into the enterprise budget here, it assumes most of the production is going to be targeted for some type of direct market sales. And here's a really important point here in terms of crop selection. You'll see the crops that are selected here tend to be based on crops that are going to provide a relatively high gross return per square foot. You're going to be needing to think about the market volume needed. You'll see some crops that have really high returns per square foot, but are only going to be marketed in a relatively small volume. So you've got several factors that you need to consider here. And the other factor to think about is just depending on the market channel that you're selling to, you may have a need to provide a diversity of crops. And that needs to be part of your factoring in terms of your crop selection. And then, of course, the space requirements that you're going to need for being able to produce these crops inside your system. So let's just have a look at how this budget is organized here. And you can see in this case the different types of enterprises that are generated. This first table up here provides a graphic that helps us to look at essentially the revenues that are being generated for this particular enterprise. And as you look at the cucumbers, eggplants, you look at the total yield, the square foot that's dedicated to it. But notice here with the price per pound, relatively high prices per pound that typically would be reflective of a retail market type situation, but allow you to then provide an estimate of what you're going to be looking at for the total revenue contributed for each one of these enterprises to your high tunnel production system. And in this case, in this particular scenario, a little over $9,600 in total revenue that is being generated. This is just looking at everything in the high tunnel system here tends to get put in a yield per square foot, gross cost, gross revenue on a per square foot basis to help us be able to evaluate the utilization of very precious space that is available in the high tunnel production system. But you can see in the last column here, it indicates the gross returns per square foot. And as you might expect, something like herbs has a very high gross return per square foot. But as we had mentioned there earlier, you're probably not going to market 20, 30 boxes worth of herbs. You're going to have a relatively small volume of product, and you want to fill out the balance of your greenhouse with other still high returning enterprises, but are going to fit that mix of volume needs, market needs, and timing needs to get into the respective markets that you are going to focus on. Just a quick look at some of the costs that correspond with your activities in the high tunnel. Anybody that has worked with high tunnels in the past will be some of the first people to step up to the plate to remind everybody that labor costs still are an enormous cost of production. And you can see here very conveniently labor costs for this particular budgeting exercise here broken out into some of the different production activities. So you've got bed preparation, general maintenance, planting, pest management activities if those are going to be required, and of course harvest, which is one of the most important ones there, indicated there again. And so you can go in and estimate for your own purposes just what sort of labor inputs that you're going to need, and ultimately look at your total labor costs. One of the things that I found to be really helpful when I'm doing a labor planning is to actually plan out a labor planogram, almost something like a week by week, or at minimum month by month, but ideally week by week labor scheduling, where you're going to have a lot of different activities with different enterprises and a fairly intensive production system to help you plan, as what you can see here, to be a pretty significant labor cost. So finally, in the bottom right box here, you'll see things, kind of your costs and revenues summarized here. So your total labor and production expenses, where your production expenses are going to include your plastic, if you have that, your other kinds of your plant material, seed, other kinds of inputs that you're going to be using, in addition to your labor, are going to come to a cost of a little over $2,700 in this particular case. And you can see that cost put into a per square foot basis here of $1.28, which is a little bit on the lower end of what we had looked at with the cost per square foot that we would see for some of the various protected agriculture operations. And then the total revenue, the $9,600 that we had seen up here in our bigger box up here, less our labor and production expenses, gives us this annual returns over those total costs of a little over $6,800 and a gross return or net return per square foot of $3.18. So I'd encourage you to pull this publication up to look at some of your own kinds of products and your own prices in your own different kinds of markets that you're targeting. And you'll see, especially as you look at some of the price per pound opportunities there, some of these enterprises are going to be very sensitive to the kind of prices that you're going to be able to get in some of these different markets. We do have some really good resources that are available in the Center for Crop Diversification. These resources are available online. I encourage you to get on there and look at some of these crop profiles, very specific production systems for unique kinds of enterprises that are being produced in a high tunnel environment. And it has some very nice additional economic considerations and some additional resources and budgeting resources that you may find helpful. There's an enterprise budget for the high tunnel brambles, for the leafy greens, strawberries, tomatoes. There's a very nice high tunnel overview leaflet there that I encourage you to have a look at there as well. So just to pull together some of our thinking on the economics, there are a couple of things that you really need to be thinking through as you're making a significant capital investment. You want to be able to be sure that you are getting a decent return on your investment, so you need to understand what is the capital investment that I'm making. And even if you have the opportunity to get some cost sharing through an EQIP program, there are still going to be some very real capital costs and certainly some significant variable costs that you're going to have to incur as you launch into your high tunnel enterprise. It really should be substantially driven. Your choice to pursue a high tunnel enterprise should be substantially driven on your understanding of your market opportunities. So you're having a clear understanding of what kind of prices, what volume of products, when those products are going to be delivered, should really be very clearly outlined as you're going into your planning for the costs and returns that are going to be associated with your high tunnel. So to that end, you need to be really realistic about your projected prices. There are some good places to get retail market information, some of our farm market price report data, but even talking with some of the different people that you're going to be potentially selling to, be sure you have a good handle on what sort of prices you're going to be able to get for some of your products before making this big capital commitment. And having your enterprise organized by these different costs, with your capital costs, your variable costs, will help you to identify your break-even costs that will allow you to make a determination of whether or not it's going to be worth your while to have a particular enterprise added to your high tunnel, or whether you want to do high tunnel production in the first place.
So with that, thank you, Tim. Just one last time, thank you so much for your attention. And if you guys have any questions that you'd like to directly talk to one of our specialists about, Dr. Shubin Saha or Dr. Tim Woods, their email addresses and phone numbers are available right there on your screen. Please don't hesitate to contact them. They're here to help you, and they'd be happy to help you. And then last but not least, we have a follow-up survey. If you have just a few minutes, there's about 8 to 10 questions on there that will just help us talk through some of the things that you learned today and other things that you would like to learn from our future program. So if you could just go ahead and fill that out real quickly for us, that would be very, very helpful. With that, that's all we've got, and thank you so much for your attention. We really appreciate you joining us, and we'll see you on Tuesday, February 24th for our second webinar about structure options for high tunnel. So thank you very much.